Penske, a name synonymous with American trucking. From 18-wheelers to box trucks rented out to people who really shouldn't be driving them, Penske has a rich history in the transportation industry. Oh, and the racing industry. They happen to be pretty good at that too. But long before the billionaire in charge owned an entire series, long before guys like Joey Logano and Will Power, Roger Penske was a force to be reckoned with in the Trans Am series. You wouldn't know it now, but a personal vendetta against Ford, combined with his whatever it takes to win mentality, gave birth to some of the greatest rule-bending and outright cheating the racing world has ever seen. From the blatantly unsafe to the downright clever, this is the story of the Penske Camaro Trans Am dynasty. Unlike some race team owners who've never gone more than 70 miles an hour on the freeway, Roger Penske knew what it took to build successful race cars, because he'd driven them. Penske got his start in hill climb racing, and later managed to compete in 2 Formula One races and even pick up a NASCAR win. But by the late 1960s, he hung up his fire suit in exchange for the more boring kind of suit, and decided to focus full-time on growing his businesses, including his very own race team operation. He would need to hire some drivers, but not just any drivers. Drivers who were just as hands-on with car preparation as they were with racing. A man named Mark Donohue fit that bill perfectly. An engineer who was equally comfortable with either a notebook or a steering wheel in his hands. Donohue had SCCA championships to his name, car design experience with Griffith, and had even been signed by Ford as a GT40 endurance driver. Penske wasn't a patient or sensitive man, so he wasted no time in recruiting Donohue for his upcoming Lola program, at a funeral of all places. In fact, it was the funeral of poor Walt Hansgen, Donohue's teammate who had been tragically killed during testing of the GT40 for Le Mans. Insensitive? I'd say so. But either way, Donohue agreed, and it was a good thing he did. He managed second place in the 1966 Can-Am Drivers' Championship and an invitation to work full-time for Penske in 1967. With the first Lola races of that year not until April, Donohue was probably thinking he could relax, with ample time to prepare the car. But boy was he wrong. Roger wanted to go racing ASAP, and the start of the 1967 Trans Am season was only a month away. Just introduced a year earlier, the SCCA's Trans Am over 2-liter category was quickly gaining reputation as a proving ground for American muscle with rigorous endurance races across the states. So what better way to keep his guys busy than to tell Donohue to go get a Camaro ready for some Trans Am action? Early on, the team battled mixed results, which shouldn't be too surprising for a last-ditch effort thrown together in under a month. They were by no means bad, with a win in Maryland and a couple of second-place finishes, but the Blue Oval boys kept coming out on top. Roger knew there had to be something the other teams were doing better. Something a little sneaky, perhaps. It turns out, those cars were on a nearly undetectable weight loss program. The teams brought them out to Lockheed Aerospace, who would dip some of the car's body panels in acid. The acid ate away at the metal and popped out bodies that looked stock, but were pounds lighter. If you couldn't tell by now, Roger liked to take everything to the extreme, so Team Penske hit the acid tanks extra hard, to the tune of dropping 250 pounds. And on the track, it showed. Following the acid dipping, Mark Donohue won the final 2 races of the season at Las Vegas and Kent, the latter of which he finished an entire lap ahead of Ronnie Bucknam's Mustang. Not suspicious at all. There's a few different accounts out there on how the SCCA caught wind of the featherweight Camaro, but they all end the same way, with Penske being told not to do it again. So, of course, the next year in 1968, they did it again. But knowing full well that the SCCA was watching them, there was some clever trickery involved. Penske was running two Camaros, a newly built 68 model, and their lightweight car from the year before. After first passing tech inspection with the heavier, new car, Penske would quickly swap the numbers to that of the lighter car and run the heavier car through tech inspection again. But the number swapping deception didn't end there. Penske used the same idea to set qualifying times for both cars using the lightweight car. Setting a fast lap time is one thing, but this was endurance racing, which meant that the time it took for pit stops was just as important. Thankfully, Penske had a trick up their sleeves for those too. In addition to the obvious like changing tires and refueling, Trans Am cars of that era had to change brake pads about every other fuel stop or so. If you've ever changed brake pads on your car, you know that you usually have to get the caliper's piston retracted back into its bore in order to fit new, thicker pads. With every second counting during a stop, Penske didn't have time to mess with that, so they developed a system to automatically retract the pistons. Using a driver-operated valve and vacuum from the car's brake booster, the Camaro's caliper pistons would automatically retract, just as the pit crew readied a new set of pads. This allowed them to change front brake pads, tires, and fuel the car, all in about 1 minute and 40 seconds, while it took Ford almost 4 minutes for the same service. The extra time saved in the pits was enough to put Penske about a lap ahead with every pad change. So, did the results reflect Team Penske's ingenuity? Without a doubt. Penske won 10 out of the 13 races, securing the 1968 championship like it was nothing. But then, trouble struck. You know the old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Well, Penske had never heard it before, because in 1969, they built two brand new cars, which turned out to be disastrous. Between suspension geometry that was out of whack and anti-roll bars that would deflect, causing unwanted preload, a painstaking amount of time tuning the cars resulted in handling that only matched the 68 models at best. But it was too late to turn back now. Penske would have no choice but to make do with the 69 models and hope for the best. Unless they could think of another clever innovation. They got to work studying the rulebook, this time focusing on the refueling section, where Donohue pointed out an interesting loophole. There was no limit to the height of a team's refueling rig, so they decided to harness the power of gravity to fill up the Camaros as fast as possible. On the day of the first race of the season in Michigan, competitors and SCCA officials were shocked at what they saw in Penske's pit. A 20-foot tall tower loomed over pit road with what appeared to be two giant fuel barrels joined lengthwise by a hose. Having the fuel that high in the air meant it would come dumping out faster than the team could even control it. But why stop at only speeding up fuel flow when you can fit even more fuel in your car? Liquids generally contract when cooled, so Penske took advantage of that too. By welding a second larger diameter barrel around the bottom barrel, Penske created a pocket for the pit crew to fill with dry ice and acetone. This cooled the fuel enough that they could reportedly fit an extra gallon into the car's tank. That is, if it all made it into the tank. This thing was an epic, dangerous mess. Fuel went everywhere, and the pressure head of the fuel was so high that shutting off the nozzle produced a kickback capable of knocking someone over. Donohue himself had this to say in his book, The Unfair Advantage. Warren Ager was our fueler at the time, and he was a little afraid. No, he was very much afraid of what could happen. But it didn't violate the rules, and it seemed to be as safe as anything else we had used, which isn't saying much. Thanks to the Penske Big Rig, the team could refill the Camaro's entire 22-gallon fuel tank in just 5.5 seconds. As a point of reference, it takes a modern NASCAR team double that amount of time to refuel a tank of about the same size. But the Big Rig was short-lived. Being the fun-loving people they are, the SCCA sent out an amended rules bulletin shortly thereafter, limiting the height of fueling rigs to 12 feet. Roger just about blew a fuse after his team had spent the modern equivalent of almost $60,000 building the Big Rig. Only making matters worse was a post-race altercation between him and Homer Perry, Ford's team manager, who, according to Donohue, called Penske something to the effect of a spoiled rich kid. That was it. Penske had it with the SCCA and Ford. He ordered his team to do whatever it would take to shut everyone up the only way he knew how, by winning another championship. Penske came back with a new fuel rig, this one only standing the new legal maximum 12 feet tall. You're probably thinking that there's no way that this thing was as good as the big rig. And you're right, it wasn't. It was even better. I'm sure you've heard that good artists copy, while great artists steal. Well, Team Penske was full of great artists, who shamelessly stole. Donohue had noticed another team using a slide valve in their nozzle, rather than a butterfly valve, so they copied that. The slide valve allowed for smoother fuel flow, less restriction, and cut down on the kickback that the poor fueler had to endure. There may have been a limit on the height of the rig, but there was nothing regarding the hose diameter, so it was time to exploit that next. Penske stepped up from a 3-inch diameter hose to a 4-inch diameter hose, which made a world of difference in speeding things up. The new rig allowed for a full fuel stop in just 3.3 seconds. The Mustang guys? They still needed around 14 seconds. Its most impressive use came during a race at Sears Point, where Mustang driver Parnelli Jones was closing in on Donohue. It seemed like Jones was going to catch him, especially considering that Donohue needed to stop for about 5 gallons of fuel. For any other team, that would have been defeat. But thanks to the fueling rig, Donohue got his 5 gallons in under a second. He won that race, along with 5 others that season, while former rival turned teammate Ronnie Bucknam grabbed 2 wins behind the wheel of the other Penske Camaro. 8 out of the 12 races belonged to Team Penske, and to the major upset of the Ford teams, they'd done it again. Another Trans Am championship fought just as hard in the pits as it was on the track. But for the Penske Camaros, that's where the story ends. Despite being a Chevrolet team, Penske felt they weren't receiving the direct support they needed from a major automaker, and began a relationship with AMC heading into the 1970 season. Whether you think Penske's Trans Am antics were fair or not, there's no erasing their status as some of the greatest cases of rule bending in racing history.